Howdy, folks. You're back with another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson here, and I am with Bible historian Dan McClellan. Howdy. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Folks, Dan McClellan is the author of The Bible Says So, which is what we're going to talk about today. He's also TikTok's Data Over Dogma. He's the award-winning Bible historian. This book is all about the different misconceptions that we have about Scripture and how he uses data, different interpretations, and his biblical scholarship to make sure that some of these get the nuance that they deserve. Is really the best way that we can talk about your work is how thorough and nuanced it is. Tell us, what is your biblical journey? Is this something you found later in life, or has this always been a part of you?
It hasn't always been a part of me. I was not raised in a particularly religious family. Well, I was born into a very religious family, and things changed when I was still very young. So I was not raised within a particularly religious family. And then a bunch of events in my early adulthood led to me being baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS or the Mormon Church, when I was 20 years old. And then I decided I wanted to go serve a proselytizing mission a year later. And in that year between getting baptized and leaving, I realized I had never read the scriptures of the Mormons, which includes the Bible and famously or infamously other scriptures as well. And so I decided in that year I was going to read all of the scriptures. And so I read through the entire Bible and all of the uniquely LDS scriptures and got out into the mission field, as they call it, and realized I was way ahead of pretty much all the other 19-year-old kids who were out there. But I just fell in love with reading the stories in the Bible. I fell in love with learning about the history, the languages, the stories, the characters, the culture, and I just wanted to know everything I could about it. And I decided when I came back home that I wanted to try to make a career studying the Bible because I just enjoyed so much the puzzle that this was to try to put together, to try to solve how to understand what's going on in the Bible. And the more I learned about it, the more complex it was, but also the more fascinating and the more interesting and the more compelling it was. And I went and got a bachelor's degree. I got 2 master's degrees, got a PhD. And the more I was learning about it, the more I saw that there was a very big chasm that separated the way that scholars in the ivory tower were thinking and talking about the Bible and the way that folks in the pews and on the streets were thinking and talking about the Bible. And scholars recognized that that was a problem, but there were not easy solutions available. So how do we bridge this gap was something that I've been contemplating ever since I started in graduate school. And I've been arguing about the Bible and religion on social media for almost 25 years. So that was nothing new to me. But with TikTok during the pandemic, I found a channel or a platform where rather than people having to come to where I am, my blog or into the chat room that I am or onto my Twitter feed or whatever, the algorithm would push it out to people who had watched related content. And so that really, I think, exposed a lot of people to the world of critical biblical scholarship. I'm surprised by how many people are not aware that there are thousands and thousands of scholars out there who study the Bible just because they want to learn more about it, not necessarily for devotional or confessional reasons. But critical biblical scholarship, I think, is very important to the way that the Bible is used and talked about and leveraged as an instrument, as a tool, even as a weapon. And so I've kind of leaned into making my career trying to help increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and also combat the spread of misinformation about the same. That's how I start all of my podcast episodes. And so, it's just something that's become a passion of mine. And now I'm very privileged to be able to make it my career in the way I make a living and keep these silly lights on that are different colors that have my kids saying, "You're like a Twitch streamer, Dad." But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
It's super cool. And it's so, like you said, it's important, it's critical. And one of the things you talked about was the difference between the ivory tower Christians and the common Christian, like the pew Christians, and I've noticed that even in Christian nationalist language, and maybe you've seen this with your time spent on the internet, but there is a Christian nationalist version that is seeking to like rewrite Americans' origin story. No, it was
Yeah.
Christian and whatnot. But something I noticed that when I was reading Pete Hegseth's books for my research is he doesn't negate that necessarily. He just goes right out and says, "Well, I think the founding fathers were wrong and we need to redo." And his audience is the Ivory Tower, Princeton, like though the Tucker Carlsons, the Sean Hannitys. And I was like, that's really interesting that there's two Christian nationalisms going on. And now I'm starting to like kind of chase that rabbit hole of like, oh,
Hmm.
wait. So, and the way that Christianity has, and I'm sure we can talk about this too, but that the way Christianity has propaganda itself in history has looked a lot of different ways. Um, Sorry, go ahead.
No,
You
well,
wanna
I,
respond
I
to that?
was I was just going to say I think that's inevitable because if it were only people saying, well, that's what the founding fathers said, it would indicate their priority is what the founding fathers said. But what their priority is structuring power here and now. And so I think people are going to experiment with different arguments and different conceptual frameworks to try to figure out what's most effective at advancing their interests in the here and now. And so it doesn't surprise me that you have an awful lot of people saying, well, that's what the founding fathers said, but other folks saying, nah, not really, but we need it to be what we're going to say. It's just an outcome of the fact that it's identity politics all the way down. None of us is driven by pure rationalism. We are all influenced by the social identities that are important to us and the needs and goals of those social identities. So that's, I had not heard that about Pete Hegseth's book, and I cannot imagine a less enjoyable time than reading a book written by Pete Hegseth. But you took the bullet, so that the rest
I
of us didn't
did.
have to.
Well, it was that, and it was a very it was a decision because I was like, I need to hear from the horse's mouth. But if I go if I go watch his videos, it'll mess up my algorithm and my timeline. I'm not trying to
Yeah,
have Pete
yeah.
Hegseth all the way down my timeline.
Well, that's what the burner account is for.
There you go. That's true. And I was like, but I also like that the book, like, this is his manifesto. Like, this is like, and he's got three. And I'm starting to like literally make videos about that. I'm like, here's what Pete Hegseth has to say about higher education. He wants you to burn your diploma or send it back. He does not like higher education. He says, and just like from the horse's mouth, this is it.
Yeah.
But in doing so, again, it almost feel like that Sun Tzu like art of war. Like I need to know what you're thinking and how you're processing things, and it it was really a struggle to be like, no, it is what the founding fathers said. And then when I came across his argument, he was like, no, it is. You're absolutely right, but they're wrong, and it should have been a Christian nation. And you're like, oh, that's different. That's a different game. um, so it's just interesting that you mentioned specifically Ivory Tower and how it's translated or interpreted in the Bible, or the Bible's translated in different formats, but also
Yeah.
movements are translated in different. So, and that's a great question. We do have Christianity has always been a part of the United States, and the Bible has been controversial long before the United States was its own nation. But that's a really interesting statement, right? Because what is the Bible? Is there one Bible? Is it the Bible? Talk to us about what's the Bible?
Well, yeah, there is no such thing as the Bible, just like I frequently say there's no such thing as the dictionary. We think of it as this kind of this abstraction that we imagine exists, but there's not really any such thing. Before you can put your hands on the Bible, you have to make decisions about what texts are we including, what manuscripts of those texts are we including, what translations of those manuscripts of those texts are we including? And there are many different ways to answer each and every single one of those questions. And with every answer, you get a multiverse of ways that Bible can exist. So yeah, there's no such thing as the Bible. And usually what people talk about is whatever has become standard or normative within the intersection of the social identities that are important to them. So if you grow up in South America and you're around Catholics all the time, the Bible has the Apocrypha in it. But if you grow up in the Southern Baptist tradition, your Bible does not have the Apocrypha in it. And, your translation might be the ESV or the NIV or something like that, or it might be the King James Version, or if, it might be the Reina Valera if you're Spanish speaking, or it might be the Almeida if you're Portuguese speaking. There's just a lot of different Bibles, and there's no way to go back to the original Bible because no such thing ever existed. And so it's really all us determining what we want the Bible to be based on whatever our social identities are, and usually it comes down to what is useful and meaningful to us.
Absolutely, and those the things that we pull from the Bible, they shape our morals, they shape our values, and it's very easy and human to then use those morals and values in how you vote. I do see online quite a bit of folks assigning political parties to Jesus or assigning economic theory to that Jesus would have been this, Jesus would have been. But is there truth to what they're saying? What's your response?
It's very similar when it comes to who Jesus was, because we can look in the New Testament and we find a bunch of different representations of Jesus. The earliest discussions about Jesus were Paul's, but he doesn't really outline the narrative of Jesus's life. He talks about it in very kind of indirect ways. And then we get Mark, the first gospel, and Mark presents Jesus a certain way. And then we get Matthew, who's really looking at Mark and borrowing a lot from Mark, but also changing a lot, saying, no, my Jesus is different. And so Matthew presents a different Jesus. Luke is still another Jesus, and John a very different Jesus from the previous three. And what we do is we collect them into one corpus, and we say, they're all the real Jesus, which means we're imposing this framework of unification on all of this, and we have to force them all to agree, which means we're not looking at the Jesus of Mark or the Jesus of Matthew or of Luke or of John. We're looking at our own Jesus that is an outcome of the process of harmonization that we must go through, and that is going to differ from interpreter to interpreter. So yeah, there's the song, personal Jesus, your own personal Jesus, and while people tend to think that that is the inappropriate way to understand Jesus, it's the only possible way to understand Jesus, and that's just when we're talking about the level of the text. If we try to reconstruct what the historical Jesus was like, it becomes even more complex, because then we're imagining, well, what kind of historical person could have resulted in people decades after their death writing about them in this way? And I think most historical Jesus scholars these days would say, when it comes to what we can know about the historical Jesus, it doesn't get much beyond, there was an itinerant Jewish apocalyptic preacher. He caught the ire of the Roman government. He was executed for his troubles. And then in the decades that followed, a tradition about his resurrection arose. And everything that is written about Jesus is really a part of curating those traditions.
And when we look at historical Jesus, when we look at the historical authors, when we look at these stories of Jesus specifically, were they written similar to how authors at the time wrote about other great leaders, or what was that like?
That's an interesting and a complex question. That what genre are the Gospels is something that has plagued scholars for a long time, and some of them just punt and say the genre is gospel, and we can't really say much more than that. There are certainly points of contact with the ancient Greco-Roman biography, and there are ways that it doesn't really fit that genre exactly. There's a wonderful book, if I remember the title correctly, The Origins of Early Christian Literature by Robin Faith Walsh, who's a friend of mine, that talks about how the authors of the Gospels were probably trained literary folks who were writing these texts for circulation among the literati, among the ivory tower of the day, to try to advance their own interests. And so there had to be some overlap with the traditional genres and the traditional conventions so that their text could gain purchase within that world. But there are ways that it departs from them as well, and particularly in talking about a lot of the miracles and a lot of the things that are not discussed as, or they're not focused on as much in a lot of the ancient Greco-Roman biographies. And a good example is Mark, the very first gospel. The very first sentence of the Gospel of Mark is the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And this happens to align very closely with an inscription that comes from the century before the Gospel of Mark, talking about the good news of the coming into the world of Augustus, the Son of God. And so this is called the Priene inscription. And this was a monumental inscription, something that was in public. And so there are ways that the authors are very clearly trying to create resonance with the ways that authoritative figures, and particularly divine figures of the day, were talked about, including Son of God. Son of God was kind of a standard epithet for emperors. Savior was a standard epithet of emperors in that time period, particularly the military-oriented emperors. And so there are a lot of ways that they're generating a picture of Jesus as kind of a competitor, as someone who's doing it better. And in order to do that, you have to kind of use some of the similar language so the reader or the hearer can understand, oh, I'm comparing Jesus to your Augustus over here. And so yeah, there are definitely ways in which the Gospels are making use of existing literary conventions.
Well, thank you. Again, folks, like this is what I'm talking about when I say like nuance, right? Like this is exactly, well, I mean, and I think that is what is so hard for people, is because it is so nuanced, and there's so much to grapple with, and it's a complex book, the quote unquote Bible, whatever the collection that we have. There's so much complexity to it that you do see why some people are like, nope, just tell me what to think. Like, that was a lot. Like, just make things real black and white. I want a nice clean box. And
Yeah.
they really, I see this a lot happening. They focus on Paul. Can you talk about like why or how some groups focus more on Paul than maybe the other gospels, or kind of where that comes from?
Well, what the Gospels are focusing on is the life and the identity and the mission of Jesus. And what that does not include is a discussion about how to structure an organization that is based on Jesus's teachings. And that's where Paul comes in. Paul, as most folks know, went on these missionary journeys. We know really about 3 of them, where along the way he's setting up congregations, actual institutions, organizations in different places that are focused on worshiping Jesus. And the letters that we have are really his letters to these organizations, curating things and governing the affairs. And so for Christians today, they're concerned about how to congregate and how to, constitute these organizations. And so Paul's letters are far more useful than the Gospels. But additionally, Paul is introducing new ideas and a slightly more cosmopolitan / philosophical approach to how you live a life as a follower of Jesus, and has some more dogmatic approaches than the way Jesus is represented in the Gospels, that align with a lot of the needs and interests and goals of particularly Christian nationalists today. So you have a lot of proof texting going on with Paul, whether it has to do with Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6 and homophobia. There's a lot of proof texting going on there. Romans 13, anybody who's studying Christian nationalism knows that Romans 13 is the trump card that gets pulled out anytime the in-group is in power. When the out-group is in power, you ignore Romans 13 studiously. But when the in-group is in power, you wave that around to let everybody know God tells you you have to listen to us and you cannot disagree with us because we are put in place by God and we are supported by God. So there are a lot of ways that Paul facilitates ecclesiastical curation and facilitates also a lot of proof texting when it comes to boundary maintenance associated with who's in, who's out, who's good, who's bad, who's pure, who's impure. Because if you go by Jesus, you're going to have to be a lot more accepting than a lot of folks today want to be, and which is why I see Deuteronomy being quoted a lot more by Christian nationalists today than any of the Gospels. It's Romans, it's 1 Corinthians, it's Deuteronomy, it's Nehemiah. Before they will ever quote Jesus, because their interests these days tend to do with ethnocentrism and right-wing authoritarianism and structuring power and values over and against the interests of marginalized and oppressed groups. And a lot of times in the Gospels, Jesus is all about supporting the social outcasts, up to and including people who are considered sexual deviants. They are going to enter the kingdom of God before the righteous Jewish people of that day, according to Matthew 21. And Christian nationalists today don't want to have anything to do with that.
Right. And and furthermore, one of these things I see you bring up Deuteronomy, but another thing is the 10 Commandments. I like to rally around if we would just follow the 10 Commandments. Who could disagree with the 10 Commandments? Well, if I'm not mistaken, the quote Bible that we use, again, I'm putting this all in quotes now, but Protestant Americans would but is has 4 different 10 Commandment versions in it, right? Can you talk about those different variations on the 10 Commandments?
Well, there's because we have this phrase of the 10 Commandments that doesn't really technically appear exactly that way anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. There is a phrase, the 10 words, dvarim, which can mean words, things, issues, concepts, something like that. That occurs, but that is not in the chapter that we usually identify as the 10 Commandments. It actually occurs much later in Exodus, toward the end of Exodus, with a collection of 10 commandments that are very different. There's a tiny bit of overlap, but mostly the commandments that are labeled the 10 things, words, issues, has to do with ritual and ceremonial stuff. So it's frequently referred to by scholars as the ritual decalogue. Decalogue meaning 10 things, words, commandments. So, and that's where we get, you should not boil a kid in the milk of its mother and stuff like that. And Exodus 20 also has 10 words, things, commandments, depending on how you divide it up. You can get from like 9 to 12 commandments, depending on how you divide it up. And then you also have in Deuteronomy 5 a repetition of what we have in Exodus 20. And in Deuteronomy 4, it talks about the 10 words, things, issues. And it seems to be referring to what's in Deuteronomy 5. So we have 2 different collections that, 3 different, because the one in Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 don't match exactly. And the one in Exodus 34 is wildly divergent. But they're all referred to directly or indirectly as the 10 things. So we've just decided, and particularly Christians, because Christians are not interested in ritual and ceremony. In fact, one of the ways that Christians rationalize why they don't follow the law of Moses is that, there were moral laws, there were ceremonial laws, there were civic laws. We're only responsible for the moral laws. And so that means, well, we can't choose what the book of Exodus explicitly refers to as the 10 commandments. We got to choose the other 10 because they're closer to being mostly moral. There are still some ritual things in there, but they're like, we're going to take that one. So, yeah, when we talk about the 10 commandments again, we're making choices. We're answering questions in different ways to land on the version of whatever it is that's going to be most meaningful and useful to us.
Well, and there's a book by another creator on here by Andrew Seidel. He's a lawyer, and I was
Mm-hmm.
talking about how if you put the Constitution next to our Bill of Rights, or sorry, if you put the Ten Commandments next to our Bill of Rights or our Constitution, there's a lot of commandments that would just not even hold up.
Yeah.
Almost all of them, I think it says.
Yeah.
I mean, even like you will have no other gods before me is a violation of freedom of consciousness. Like that, their conscience. It's just like, um, it's just like it almost like drives you crazy because you're like, wait, the logic's not flowing. Like,
Yeah. And what a lot of people, you have the 10 commandments put on display outside of courtrooms and things like that, but they tend to omit certain parts of it, particularly the part where God says, visiting the iniquities of the father on the children to the fourth generation, as well as the parts that refer to the slaves. In modern America, we don't like to remind ourselves that according to the Bible, slavery is A-OK. Not with the way we interpret the Constitution. But I think it's interesting that we would put on display the 10 Commandments outside of courtrooms where they have no authority at all. And this is something that I think is fascinating that a lot of people either don't know about or refuse to accept. When you look at all the law codes that are in the Hebrew Bible, many of them directly contradict parts of other law codes in the Bible. And a lot of scholars these days have concluded that, you know what, they probably were not really enforced in ancient Israel. These were probably propaganda. They were for public display, but just like our 10 commandments outside the courtrooms that are on public display, they weren't actually governing what was going on inside the courtroom. And this is how you can have the covenant code and the holiness code and the laws in Deuteronomy and elsewhere directly contradicting each other because, well, they weren't really deciding cases based on these things anyway, which I think, raises the question of why do people think we should be enforcing them now if they didn't even enforce them anciently?
right, right. Thank you for that. Born and raised in Texas. I live in Montana now, but I've heard it growing up. I even
Yeah.
worked at the Texas Senate in college, and they would talk about like,
Really?
we need to get 10 commandments in here, and I would just, and I have a lot of things to say about that internship, but
I can imagine.
I that's what I guess we're kind of circling back to that. There are very few things that are clear in the Bible. Um,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of ways that people will say things are clear because of the Ten Commandments. Oh, abortion is murder, thou shalt not kill, therefore, boom. Can There's also this notion about child sacrifice that's being weaved into the messaging coming out of JD Vance. I've heard it now twice, that the Democrats have been sacrificing babies since Roe v. Like, I mean, like, and I'm like, wait. Um, First of all, let's talk about, is abortion murder? Is the Bible clear that abortion is murder? How about that?
I would say that not only is the Bible not clear because it never directly addresses murder, uh, the issues it does address that are in any way relevant to the question make it pretty clear that it would, at least based on these other issues, would not have considered it murder because, and I talk about this at some length in the book, Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 through 25 have this weird law. It's borrowing one of the laws from the laws of Hammurabi. And, it's one of those things that doesn't really happen. But there's a law there because they wanted to put on display how ordered and righteous and just they were. So it talks about how two men are fighting. If they accidentally injure a pregnant woman, here's what to do if two different things happen. If the injury causes the woman to miscarry, that's a fine imposed by the husband, and there are judges there to arbitrate it so that it's not exorbitant. If the injury causes permanent harm, and specifically death, to the woman, then it's what's called talionic justice, the life for a life principle. And the idea is basically the woman, the mother, the pregnant woman, is a full legal and moral person. And the law is, if you cause permanent injury or death to a full legal and moral person, whatever you did to them gets done to you. But for the fetus, it's just a fine. And it's a fine that the husband gets to pick, which a lot of people don't bring up, but I talk about in the book. There's not a standardized value for a fetus. For an enslaved person, the standardized value is 30 shekels. They were considered more property than person, but the fetus is considered even more property than person. And so in the case of someone who accidentally kills a fetus, it is quite clearly not considered the same as the taking of a full legal and moral person. So right there, the fetus is not a person. The destruction of a fetus is not considered murder. So that's the closest to addressing the question that we get in the entire Bible. Because in this time period, the person was understood to begin at birth and at the drawing of the first breath. And this is based on an interpretation of something that we have in Genesis 2, where Adam, the breath of life, is breathed into his nostrils and he became a living soul. And the idea there is that breath is fundamentally constitutive of life. The flood kills everything that had in its nostrils the breath of life. There are three words that are frequently translated life in the Hebrew Bible: chaim, ruach, and nefesh. And ruach and nefesh actually mean breath. They refer to the neck, the throat, the breath, wind. And so they are frequently translated life, and they literally mean breath. And so that was the way things were in the time period of the Hebrew Bible. When the Greco-Roman period starts, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, then you have the Hellenistic period. And this is when there's a lot of influence coming in from the Hellenistic world. Greek becomes the new language of wider communication, the new lingua franca. And you have influence from Greek philosophy. And in Greek philosophy, they were arguing about when the person began, when ensoulment occurred, when the soul entered the body. And the three main positions were one that was held by the Epicureans and the Pythagoreans, which was that it happened at conception. The Aristotelians said, no, it happened when the fetus had become fully formed, and you can tell because then the fetus, it moves independently and the mother can feel it. That's called the quickening. And then the Stoics said, no, it happens when the baby comes into contact with the outside air at birth. And you have Christians who are kind of siding with the Epicureans and the Pythagoreans in the earliest time period. But the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, very clearly is adopting an Aristotelian position. And you see this actually in their translation of the law from Exodus 21, because they fiddle with it a little bit. And it's not miscarriage results in a fine, death of the mother results in the death penalty. It's if the fetus is born fully formed, if the fetus is born and it's not fully formed, that's the fine. If the fetus is born and it's fully formed, then it's the death penalty, which reflects the notion that once it is fully formed, the soul enters the body. Christians are we kind of like the Epicurean Pythagorean position. And then Augustine in the early 5th century CE makes the case for the Aristotelian position, and that becomes the consensus view of Christianity until we get down to the 17th, 18th, and the 19th century is when there are formal declarations that the human person begins at conception. So you do have different positions and different influences. The Christian position, based on Greek philosophy, is not anywhere in the New Testament. You can't find anything in the New Testament that really talks about it, except for maybe the idea that John the Baptist leapt in his mother's womb for joy upon hearing the voice of Elizabeth. At best, what that indicates is the Aristotelian position, that post-quickening, this is a a full legal and moral person that can feel joy and that can recognize voices and stuff like that. So
Well, and
that's really the best you can do in the Bible.
and Aristotelian sounds like Roe v. Wade. Like, I'm trying to like I'm
I
trying to
mean,
like sort it, and I know you can't
yeah.
do that. There's not one to one, but I'm like, okay, like,
Well, I
um,
think it shows that what Roe v. Wade was trying to do was negotiate between the kind of conflict of the two sets of rights. When does the right of the fetus eclipse the right of the woman to bodily autonomy, to privacy, to all the things, all the rights that she's supposed to have? So I think it is it's trying to balance the two sets of rights and decide when one overtakes the other. And so, yeah, it does sound a lot more Aristotelian than in any of the other positions. And I would suggest, and a lot of evangelical leaders, when Roe v. Wade was decided, said, you know what, sounds good to us, we're on board. And it wasn't until folks like Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell went on their campaign of abortion bad around the country that the evangelical movement kind of decided to make opposition to abortion a central identity marker. And now you can't really be an evangelical and endorse abortion in most congregations because it has become so firmly entrenched as a central identity marker. But yeah, it's really just kind of a legal articulation of more or less what Christianity has held to for the overwhelming majority of its existence.
yeah, and there's like you said, there's no, actually, I wanted to talk more about your time in Mormonism because we talk about you just mentioned evangelical and how like abortion is very much a part of. I don't. How would you put it in their dogma? It's not a dog. In their politic in their because it's. I don't know where you would put these political like big points. But how has so you received your PhD from Exeter? You're
Mm-hmm.
now a Brigham Young professor, and you work
No,
a lot.
I have taught at Brigham Young in the past as an adjunct instructor. I'm not a
Sorry.
professor there. No worries. I now just work full time doing public scholarship.
Great, awesome. We need that. How was your time? I know that you talked about you were being raised in Latin, how you found your faith was through Latter Day Saints. What was it like to work for a Latter Day Saint institution and to be somewhere like in Utah?
I was that was a wonderful job. I'm very privileged to have been able to have that job as a scripture translation supervisor, because it allowed me to bring kind of critical scholarship into church headquarters and share that with a lot of folks who had not been exposed to it before. But it also allowed me to travel all around the world and get to know Latter-day Saints and members of other religious traditions from all over the place. Tiny islands in the Pacific I had never heard of before, and a lot of other places I had never imagined I would ever be able to travel to. I had such a wonderful time, and I was trying very hard to help people get to understand the Bible a little better. I published an essay in an LDS journal one time called Latter-day Saints in the Bible, and the idea was a lot of Latter-day Saints don't know how Bible translation works. They don't know how Bibles work. They don't know why Bibles are translated certain ways, typeset certain ways, printed certain ways, sold certain ways. And so I considered my kind of mandate while I was there to be to educate the people around me and the people in the broader LDS community on what the Bible is and how we can most effectively and most productively engage with it. So I had a wonderful time. I had to wear a shirt and tie every day, which I hated. And I had to shave, which obviously I also hated. But I worked with just phenomenal people, and also got exposed to a lot of dogmatism and a lot of the kind of institutional priorities that a lot of people who sit in the pews and maybe even have local leadership roles don't often see, and that exposure kind of made me aware of a lot of things that I had not thought about in the past. But yeah, I really loved and appreciated that job, and particularly loved and appreciated the people. And I still regularly interact with a number of folks from my old workplace. Although these days it's with a beard and in a comic book T-shirt. So
Well, and it connects. I know that sounded like I just kind of went random on that one, but it connects back because when we talk about abortion as murder, we talk about, um, what I heard you in that explanation was almost a nuance of property, like the fetus as property.
yes.
Um, and particularly out in the West, as mentioned, I live out in Montana. You have some experience in Utah, and I've studied quite a
Hmm.
bit about women's history out here and how literally, because of the low tax base, women were afforded individual rights. Otherwise, the government would have to, have some sort of care for them, and they couldn't afford it. And
Hmm.
they worked a lot with Mormon women, and it was a lot of Mormons did a lot to advance women's rights. And it hit once it got steamrolling, it clashed with the South because the Southern Christian women didn't like the polygamy aspect, and they were like, "Well, hold on," like, and and so it's interesting to see how movements like move and shake.
Yeah,
Um,
Utah. I think Utah and Wyoming were two of the first states to allow women to vote. Although there was some back and forth a little bit, but yeah, absolutely, that was it. It is interesting how very different those histories are from the way we think about them, and how and this is something I lament about uh, the way Latter-day Saint communities are today, because we used to be so radical. We used to be such radical interpreters of the Bible. We used to be separatists and so concerned with doing our own thing. And then, in my opinion, we kind of decided once we got folded into the United States that we needed to hitch our wagon to a group that would allow us access to power and resources. And in the mid 20th century, we decided that was going to be the evangelicals. And now we're kind of like the stepbrother of evangelicals. We want them to respect us, but they only respect us as far as our votes allow them to advance their own interests. But that I had not thought about the dynamic of women in the South conflicting with the women
funny.
on the frontier.
Well, and then also Utah on the forefront. You talk about being radical. Utah, I think, was the first and only state in their constitution that explicitly said the lack of faith you have a right to your faith or a lack of faith. Like everybody else just said you have a right to your faith, right to
Yeah.
worship, whatever. But like they were one of the first state constitutions that was like, and if you don't, you're good too. And it's Utah for as much flack as the Mormons get. I'm like, they're like, we should be like, we should study them.
Yeah, there was a time when when they were real ones. I think these days there are still a lot of folks who I think represent our tradition well. We are outnumbered, however, by the folks who would rather just vote for a sexual predator because he tags the right identity markers, and that's something that I lament pretty much
It's
every single
a
day.
well, and it's a failure of the two parties, and I think then you get the two parties, and then it's all of that too, because
Yeah.
but yeah, so you what are you working on next in the public with so much going on? I've really appreciated how do I want to say this? Is a delicate. I don't appreciate that this is happening. I'm appreciating your breakdowns. Recently, there was the invasion of Venezuela, and you remarked on, you showed the video, talked about how they quoted Matthew, we are the peacemakers, and really tying in that the American military is here for some sort of Christian mission. Probably I mean, that might be the most blatant. I mean, they've been very blatant this whole time, but that was
Yeah.
DHS And it was, and I think I commented on your video and I was like, I can't believe that's a budget line item that the taxpayer is paying for is a DHS hype videographer. Like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
someone
yeah.
that I'm mad about that now.
I remember that comment. I laughed at that at that comment.
But it's a scary thing to start asserting that your political party comes in the name of peace, particularly when it also has control of nukes,
Hmm.
um, tariff and economic things that could change a whole continent's economy in a
Yeah.
day. Um, where Thank you for that breakdown. How else are you seeing that the inconsistencies of Christian nationalism are starting to play out? A lot of this, sometimes it takes people speaking out to truth, and sometimes the truth happens and they're inconsistent with their response. Um, what are some other ways that you're seeing inconsistent Christian nationalist responses to major political headlines?
I think one of the most glaring ways from just 2 days ago is the murder of Alex Preddy in Minneapolis. And suddenly you're having Trump saying, oh, you're not allowed to have a gun. And you have a bunch of folks who were, have Molon Labe stickers on their truck who are suddenly saying, oh, why would you carry a gun in public? And they've turned into comply or die at the flip of a switch when it became politically expedient because a member of the out group was murdered by an agent of the state. Now suddenly we've got you can't really gin up a legal case for authorized use of deadly force. It's very clearly an illegal killing. And so what you have to do is just try to make the dude sound like a person you don't have to feel bad about having been murdered. And even if it means condemning him exercising a right that you've spent your entire adult life just belligerently braying shall not be infringed, is just one of the most laughable pieces of inconsistent principle asserting. Though it's just so profoundly hypocritical that everything just turned on a dime. One person turned virtually only the NRA is like, let's pump the brakes a minute. We kind of stand for this.
It's our whole thing.
Yeah, it's their whole thing. Isn't that your thing, guys? But so many on the right are suddenly saying, no, you're not allowed to have a gun, and carrying a gun at a protest that turns violent is a license to murder you. It's it would be comical if it were not a harbinger of a fascist regime that is trying to take over the nation.
But isn't that kind of what's happening? Like you said, they talk about Deuteronomy. God's pretty angry in those early books, and there's a lot of hierarchy, a lot of revenge.
Mm-hmm.
A good point you made in your book. I'm going to keep showing the book because I'm trying to push it.
I appreciate it.
Um, is that God pretty frequently treats life as negligible,
Oh, yeah.
um, and so there's just the saddling, like they run back and forth, anything but the Gospels, right? Like,
Yeah.
we'll go anywhere else.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just, and then on top of it, as someone who's worked in marketing, I was like, to come out and lie, and then you kept lying, and then it just had the credibility it loses, the mess that it made, and how they lost control with that lie when they could have, and I'm not defending them at all, but they could have just been like, yeah, those officers have been removed. So like they could have had a statement and like cleaned it and then kept going with their regime, but they didn't. It
Yeah.
like like I don't know. They're not even really smart with their own regime. And
No.
like if you're going to be evil,
Yeah. Be tactical about it. Like
right?
engage in some damage control, because they could have. I mean, it's just one dude. They don't care about that agent. They could not care less if he had been killed. it just would have been an opportunity for them to exploit it. So yeah, they could have said that was an illegal killing. He's been removed from duty. He will be tried. He will be punished if he is found guilty. And then that would have just disarmed the left, and they would have, like you said, been able to carry on doing the thing. But yeah, it shows that they're not being very, very thoughtful about it, that they're just trying to they've got the blinders on, and they're just trying to foment chaos, foment violence, foment unrest. And yeah, the first Trump presidency, his error was having somewhat competent people in his administration, and he fixed that error for his second administration. He's gotten rid of anybody with any appreciable degree of competence. Unfortunately, it means their competence for hiding what they're doing is also non-existent. So, yeah, I had not thought about that, but that is kind of hilarious that they could have avoided all of the blowback, and now you've lost the NRA. Like, how do you lose the NRA?
Well, I mean, and I know we've got, oh gosh, but I wanted to kind of put something on your radar too, which I think is really cool about you being a biblical historian, working and introducing these concepts. This past summer, I had the opportunity to spend 2 months in Pakistan working alongside folks.
Wow.
I did. I was. That's kind of my thing is women's issues, and so I was doing girls' education, and then working with women who were refugees of the Taliban. They were Afghan refugees, and one of the things that and so what that meant is because of this organization, it was a very prominent organization. I got to work with a lot of experts, scholars. Like it wasn't just like some random. It was like legit. And one of the things they talked about that's so scary with the Taliban specifically is that, yes, the Taliban has always been a religious extremist. Like, I mean, it's like that. But the Taliban of, say, like the 70s through the 90s had a lot more scholarship, competent theology. And as it's grown more and more radicalized, um, because of the West's actions and because of not, like, right? There's a lot of nuance in why the Taliban's doing what it's doing, but
Mm-hmm.
they have lost competent theologians. And so what the other organizations were sharing with me is like, it's Muslim in name, but they've gone totally rogue. Even their most conservative supporter, like extreme theologians, are not showing up. And so the ones that they have are just blatantly militaristic. And it just like, as I'm sitting there, I'm doing this work, but I also knew how much this was playing in the back of my head with American Christian nationalism that very easily, it breaks it very easily. It breaks down into Proud Boys and Jan 6, like in a
Mm-hmm.
heartbeat. And so I think that's why it's so important for folks like you to keep clergy and theologians accountable. Like this scholarship is critical. And of course, these Taliban folks are willfully ignoring it. Um, but that was such a profound statement was that they were like, oh no, we wish that they were practicing Sharia law because they would have been a lot less violent. We wish that like the Taliban has gone so rogue. It's beyond.
Yeah.
And so competent theology, folks, have like, and I'm not saying necessarily I come from the Disciples of Christ denomination. We don't like creeds. We don't like people claiming biblical authority. It's kind of our thing. But just because, we don't like to give too much biblical authority away does not mean we can't look at scholarship and expertise, right?
Yeah.
So, not funny. Like to have a whole denomination made up and be like, you can't tell me what it says. And then like, okay, but at the same time,
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot with Jewish approaches as well, because I think famously, you get 3 rabbis in a room, you have 4 opinions. I think that was something when I was at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. That was, they kept kosher there. That was a Jewish run organization, and I got to know several Jewish scholars. And I just love that they spoke of the Bible as an invitation to wrestle, not as the answers, not as the rules, but as tools for engaging in a wrestle. And so, yeah, I think I love the idea of a Christian community that's doing the same. That's that's refusing to accept somebody trying to bash them over the head with the Bible as some kind of rule book.
Yeah. Well, and the disciples will cry. The history is funny like that because it splits too, right? Everything does, and you have everyone saying you can't tell me what the Bible says, and you wind up with someone like me and Ronald Reagan claiming the same denomination, and I'm like, I don't think something has gone wrong here, but that's what happens. So,
Christian Kobes Dume has a lot of great insight on Reagan's use of Christianity in his administration. But yeah, that is it is a little hilarious.
No, and she's fantastic. She's definitely been. I don't know if you can see it, but I have a whole stack. My boyfriend came down recently, and he was like, "Are you reopening the O.J. Simpson file?" I was like, "No, I'm just going after Christian nationalism and military chaplaincy, and I need everybody, like, everybody." So, but yeah, I'm so grateful for your time. I can't imagine how busy you are with your book, with your massive following. You're
Well, thank
awesome.
you.
And we need more folks like you. Please, you have an invitation to come back anytime. If you're like, I really just need to vent about something and I need to go on her podcast to do it. Come on. But thank you, Dr. Dan McClellan. You have been awesome.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
How can folks reach you? How can they support you? What can they do to learn more?
I'm all over social media, much to the chagrin of an awful lot of people. But I go by @McClellan, a phonetic spelling of my last name, MAKLELAN, on TikTok, on YouTube, on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads. I'm all over the place, and I teach online classes. I'm in a couple of weeks. I'm going to start up my Part 1 Introduction to Biblical Hebrew online class. And then I also have a Patreon where I have a Discord that I'm fairly active on, depending on my schedule. But patreon.com/McClellan, spelled MAKLELAN. I'm all over the place, and I'm just starting to work on my next trade book, which is going to be a biography of the God of the Bible, where I'm going to be talking about how the God of the Bible changes from the earliest literary layers all the way through to the latest, and why. And I'm very excited to write that book. I think that one will be a lot of fun.
I am too. I'm just thinking, it's like God's super angry in the Hebrew Bible, and then also,
Yeah,
and then he was super
get,
loving there for a minute.
you get the whole spectrum across both corpora. It's I think it's not reducible to a simple Old Testament vengeful God and New Testament merciful God. You find the vengeful and the merciful in both. But yeah, it's going to go into a lot of detail about how they really had a very, very different understanding of God in the Hebrew Bible than we do today. And I think, and hopefully it will fascinate folks to learn about how different God was understood to be in the past.
Thank you so much for that. That's going to be cool. Folks, the Bible says so. This is what it looks like. There it is. Go order it. Go follow him. Go learn. Go be okay with things having a lot of nuance, detail, and just different ways of perspective. That's history of humanity, history of Christianity, history of us. Thank you so much, folks, for joining me on another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee, and I'll see you next time.